Hey. Well, good morning. So glad that you're here with us at Parkview. I want to say hi to all our campuses, Homer Glen, New Lenox, Orland Park, watching online. We're so glad that you're here. I hope you're enjoying this holiday weekend. And we are closing this series called Sound Mind this last week. And this is an incredibly important series to me. But before I get going, I do want to say this. In today's message, I'm going to talk a bit about anxiety and depression, but also about self-harm and about suicidal ideation, and things like that. And I know within the sound of my voice, there may be some people who that conversation gets your brain into a trauma response, and you lock up and you struggle with that conversation. So if that's where you are, I want to let you know there is no reason for you to stick around. If you know that's where you're going to go, feel free to step out. There's no shame in that. God is with us in our mental health, and so God knows where you are and where you're coming from. I'm going to tell a story here in a minute. That would be a great time for you if you would like to step out. We've been in this series, and we've been talking about things like anxiety and depression and burnout, and I am really passionate about this series for a lot of reasons. One of which is I myself have struggled with depression in the past and some obsessive-compulsive disorder due to some childhood trauma. And so I've been working through some things myself, and so being able to talk about this has been really important. But today I want to talk about what it means for those of us who are walking with people who are wrestling with mental health challenges, because there's the one side of the people who are experiencing it, and if that's where you are, welcome. We're glad that you're here, and we know that God has some encouragement for you. But if you're someone who is a family member, grandparent, parent, who spouse, friend, coworker who's walking with someone, we want to encourage you. What do you do? How do you bring hope to this person's life? All of my life, I've been a fan of music. And from my early years of stealing, it wasn't really stealing. Like, my parents knew I was doing it. I was grabbing their vinyl collection and going off into my room and listening to like Jackson Browne and the Electric Light Orchestra and Cat Stevens. And then I grew up in the 80s and 90s where we created the best music y'all have ever heard, and you're welcome. It's the least we could do. We created this great music, so I was a part of that. When I was in high school and college, I was in a metal band, and no, I will not explain more about that or show you pictures. And now in my later years, I've kind of got into the whole sad dad music, the acoustic and country and all of that good stuff. I've loved music, and one of the things I've really loved is going to concerts with my family, both my wife and now my daughter, getting to experience music with her. And a few years ago, my wife and I went to see one of my favorite artists, the boss, Bruce Springsteen, at Wrigley Field. And it was an incredible, incredible show. He was 64 at the time, and he played for 4 hours. Listen, I don't know what I'm going to be doing at 64. Probably not that. I will be happy to get out of bed with the least amount of things cracking and popping. But it was this amazing show, and as I looked down the rows left and right of me, I saw people of all different ages and stages and backgrounds, and everybody was singing. We were singing Born to Run and The River and Atlantic City and all those, Born in the USA. We were singing all those songs together. And the one thing I noticed is everybody felt like they were getting this lift, right? We were all like enjoying, there was this joy in everybody's face. And I mean, beverages may have been involved for some people, not for me, but maybe for some. It was an artificial joy. But we were all together in this, and I don't know, I just thought to myself, I don't know what kind of day these people have had. I don't know where they're coming from or what they're struggling with, but something about this same song that we shared gave lift to people. And maybe that's one of the things you experience when you come to your campus. We sing together at the beginning, and there's maybe no matter what kind of week you've had, you come in and there's something about it that just lifts you up. There's a passage in a whole book in the Bible called the Psalms, and the Psalms are, some scholars believe they were songs that people in early Israel's worship tradition sang together. And so they would get together, and some of the Psalms were songs they would actually sing when they were together. And one of my favorite Psalms is this one. It's Psalm 40, 1 through 3. And it says this: I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the desolate pit, out of the miry bog. And he set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Could you imagine being in a room with people all singing this together? Because there's going to be some people who are singing that song who they are in the desolate wasteland place. They're in the miry bog kind of place. And there are going to be some people who are in the new song kind of place, and their hearts are being lifted by God. And there's some people it's like, well, it depends on the day. Like this week has been both. I've been in the bog and I've been singing the new song. And this is why I wanted to bring this up, because when we are struggling, when our mental health becomes a challenge, it affects the way that we see reality. One of the biggest things about mental health is we see ourselves, others, and even God differently because of the way that mental health changes our brain. And so sometimes when we're wrestling with mental health, we can get to the point where we believe there's only one song. And it's the desolate song. It's the bog song. And so for those of us who walk with people who are wrestling with mental health challenges, one of the things that we are asked to do, we want to do, we get to do, is help the people in our lives know that's not the only song. There is a new song that God has in mind that you could sing. And I believe this is really important because this idea of mental health affects all of us. As a matter of fact, in a study, the Barna Group found that 54% of Christians state they have a mental health issue that affects their relationships, and that's just Christians. All of us at some point, if you haven't already, are going to either experience a mental health crisis or you're going to have someone in your life who experiences this as well. So it's very important for us to know what that looks like, and then how do we come alongside of people, and how do we help them? How do we let them know that there's a new song to sing? So I don't know where you're coming from. Maybe you're a parent and you have a child who's dealing with anxiety, depression, self-harm, which is a way of coping with big emotions. Maybe you're a spouse of someone who's dealing with postpartum depression or clinical depression. Maybe you're a grandparent watching your child go through that or your grandchild go through that. Maybe you have a family member or a friend who's dealing with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, whatever that might be. What I want to encourage you with today is God is inviting all of us to walk beside those who are struggling with their mental health and to help them hear that there is a new song, to get deep into their lives and help them hear that there's a new song. But what does that sound like? What does that new song look like? Well, I want to take you into a story of the life of Jesus because, church. And Jesus seems like a good place to start. I don't know, maybe you'll disagree. There's this, at the end of the book of John in the Gospels, this is the story, 4 stories of the life of Jesus, the last one, the book of John. At the end, there is this series of passages, John 13 through 17, that some people call his farewell discourse. And they say that because these are the last things that Jesus said and did with his disciples before he died. And at the very beginning, there's this very interesting thing that happens. None of the other gospel writers included, except for John. I want to talk about what happens here, and this is what it looks like. It says, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and to return to the Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and then he began to wash the feet of the disciples, drying them with the towel he had around him. And when Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus replied, You don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. So Jesus washes the disciples' feet, and then later, this is what happens. Jesus says, "And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you." If you're wondering what this has to do with mental health, we'll get there. Here's what you need to know. Everything that Jesus did, it seemed like everything that Jesus did in his life was sort of turning upside down everything people thought about what Jesus should be doing in his life. Everything that they thought he should do, he did the opposite. And this is one of those times. But the other thing you need to know about Jesus is everything Jesus did is something he would see his Father, is something he would see his Father God doing. So if God were here, that's what he would be up to. So if you're ever wondering, what does God look like? Who is God really? Look at Jesus. Everything he did, everything he said, the way he was, the way he showed up, that's what God would be like were he to show up here and now. So this was a new kind of thing that Jesus was doing. And the disciples really didn't know what to do with it. Are you going to wash my feet? Is this really happening right now, Jesus? I have no idea what you're doing. But this act of washing feet was also a symbol. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the humiliating sacrifice Jesus was going to make on the cross. And in the cross, Jesus jumped into the one thing that we all think the most about and are most concerned about, which is death. Jesus jumped into the mess of our mortality. On the cross, Jesus died so that he would know and understand what it's like for us as we fear death, but then so that he could overcome it. So this moment of Jesus washing the disciples' feet wasn't just like, this should be nice. It was Jesus saying, this is a different world that you're living in. This is a different thing that I'm doing. I am getting into the mess with you. And so washing of feet in this passage can mean a whole bunch of different things, but the one thing I would say is that washing feet can be a metaphor for entering the mess with someone. Washing feet can be a metaphor for entering the mess with someone. And why this is important is because for those of us who are walking with friends, family, spouses, children, grandchildren, who are dealing with mental health challenges, what they need most is for someone who will step into the mess with them, who will not try to help them from a distance, but who will get into what they're going through. That's where we get close enough to help them sing this new song. And that's the image that Jesus leaves for us. So what does that mean, like practically? How do we do it? Let me break the passage down a little bit for us. First thing that we hear is in 13:1, Jesus said, it said that Jesus had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. Let's just be honest, the word love is problematic. We say things like, we love tacos. And then right after that, we say, and I love my child. It shouldn't be the same. If it's the same for you, I have hours in my office. You could come and see me. We'll talk about the difference between the two. I love University of Michigan football. Not the same way I love my wife, though when fall comes, she may wonder if there's a difference between the two. There's something about love that we don't always get. But one scholar of this passage says there's two different ways you can look at that. When Jesus said he loved his disciples, it says he loved them to the very end. And it either means the extent or the amount of love that Jesus showed, like the fullest with everything he had. But it can also mean a time frame. Like Jesus loved them to the very end of his life. And I feel like it's a little bit of both. And so for those of us who really understand what love means, especially when we have someone in our life that we love who's struggling, it's both what do we do with everything that we have, and how do we do it for as long as we possibly can. In late 2019, we got a call from my daughter's school. And they said, we noticed that your daughter has some marks on her arm. And so we talked to her, and she said, yeah, I started cutting myself. We're like, oh, okay. This is difficult. She said, there are just some big emotions that I can't handle, and I started cutting myself. And she gave me permission to tell this story, by the way. And then later in 2020, she came to my wife and I and said, I think I want to take my own life. And she had a plan. I don't know if you're a parent or not, but they don't tell you how to deal with this. There's not a chapter for this and what to expect when you're expecting. There's nothing out there to help you understand what it means when your child, the kid that you read Goodnight Gorilla to, the kid that you fed, the kid that you changed, the kid that you taught to ride a bike, comes to you and says, I want to die. And my wife and I, our faces said, oh, and in our heads we're like, ah, because that's what happens. Drew Sherman, who's a pastor in Texas, said that when we are confronted with someone we love who is dealing with a mental health crisis, there are 3 different things that we go through, and he uses the initials CIA, and this is what it looks like. The first thing we do is we try to control. We wanted to fix it. I feel like I want to take my life. Well, let's fix that. Is that really how you feel? Maybe you're just going through a phase. It's not a phase. Okay, so let's call the counselors. Let's lock up everything sharp in the house. So we bought little boxes and we put all of our knives and all our medication. We locked it up with different combinations and kept them in different places. And if you've never looked around your house for how many sharp things you have, they're everywhere. So we tried to control it. We called We called counselors. We would go through 5 hospitalizations over the next 2 years. So we got the intake done. We did all of those things. And then we finally got to the point of saying, well, we can't control this. We can't fix it. So then we began to influence it. How do we show up? How do we listen well? How do we learn? What does she need from us? What does she not need from us? And then we finally got to the place of acceptance. What do we have to come to terms with? Eventually we came to terms with saying, this is going to be our life as a family. Now, I'm very happy to say that now she's singing a new song and she's got to a stable place, but there's something about it. Yeah, thank you. But you don't really know how you love until something like this happens. And you go through all these stages of control, of influence, and then finally acceptance. Because you've never been prepared for that, right? And there's some of you I know who know exactly how this feels. When I was thinking about this message, there's a dear friend of mine who I know has gone through depression and some of the same things. And I said, hey, if you were me, what would you want people who have never gone through mental health challenges to know about what it's like to be you? And she sent me several things. And one of the things she said was this. She said, my depression has the power to absolutely level me pretty much out of nowhere. The struggle for me is as frustrating for me as it is for you. It's not something I choose and is desperately something I wish I could make go away. She also said my mental health journey isn't linear. It isn't a straight line. Sometimes I have a few really good weeks, and then seemingly out of nowhere, I have a day, a few days, a week, where everything feels really exasperated and I get thrown off kilter. It's not linear. You can't predict it. And finally, she says, I had people say to me, you have all these mental health challenges because you don't pray enough. And she said that was like a slap in the face. That's like saying someone with a physical disability must not be praying enough because they're still disabled. Just because my illness is invisible doesn't mean it's fair game to say harmful things about my spiritual life. And then she said this, which I think is so important. Coming out of my darkest depressive episode was actually when I saw God the most clearly working in my life. My spiritual life was the strongest it's ever been. So for those of you who are struggling with your own mental health, can I just encourage you and say there is a new song, and there are places and people who are going to listen to you and learn the song that you're hearing. And God will also be with you in the midst of it. But for those of us who are walking with others, it's important for us to just admit we have no idea what that person in our life is dealing with. We have no idea. So what we do is we need to learn from them. We need to show up and learn from them what it's like to be them. What does it feel like to get up one day and feel great and get up the next day and be totally knocked off kilter? The best way that we learn to love with everything we have is to show up and learn from those people in our life, to help them sing the new song. So then the next step comes, and this is when Jesus takes some action. It says, so Jesus got up from the table, he took off his robe, and he wrapped a towel around his waist, and he poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around them. This act, this is the nerdy part of the sermon, so if you want to nerd out with me, this is the time to do it. If not, you got a phone. Check it out. Typically, this part of the meal, this act of washing feet, was done by the person at the meal who was the lowest on the social ladder. So this was the outcast person who came and washed everybody else's feet. So of course, for the disciples, this was a totally new song Jesus was singing. Like, you're going to do this? Can't believe that you're actually going to do this. And so what he did is he got a basin, not this one, this one's mine, and that was a long time ago, and it wouldn't have lasted. He got a basin that looked somewhat like this, and then he got a towel that was probably bigger than this one and not from Kohl's. And so he got these two things. He fills this basin with water, and then he gets the towel and he puts it around his waist. Now, here's what you need to know. When they were sitting at the table, they're not sitting in chairs. The tables in the ancient Near East were almost on the floor. And when the disciples came in, they would have sat down, leaned on the table, and kicked their legs out to the side so that their feet were laying parallel to the ground. So think about this picture. When Jesus gets down to wash their feet, he is almost in plank position. He is on his face right by their feet. And some scholars say that, maybe the disciples walked through, they walked everywhere. There were no cars or anything. So their feet were filthy. And some of them may have walked through, dung and horse droppings and all of that stuff. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But in any case, if you walk everywhere in a dusty place with open-toed sandals, you got some dirty dogs. It's just the thing. And so Jesus gets down almost on his face, and he gets into this place where he is face to face with the filthy feet of his disciples. Feet in Jesus' culture were a very intimate thing. And they still are today, let's be honest. When's the last time you let somebody wash your feet? We don't do that necessarily. So he gets down into this place. Actually, in the older parts of the Bible, in the Old Testament, the phrase uncovered their feet was code word for, well, private grown-up time, if you want to know the truth. Now, that's not what's happening here, but the feet are a very intimate thing. So what Jesus is doing in this moment is he is diving into the deepest, darkest, most intimate part of the life of his disciples. He is getting in deep with them. And that matters a lot because one of the best ways that, if this is an image for how we get into the mess with people in our life who are dealing with mental health, one of the best ways that we can help them is to get deep enough into their lives to hear what's actually going on with them, to pay attention. It's like this. Sometimes we care for people, and here's how we treat them. We give them like the finger gun treatment. We're like, hey, you good? How you doing over there? Everything good? You good? I'm good. You good? And we sort of do this from a distance. And Jesus, instead of going, you good, guys? How are you guys doing? Instead, what he says is, let me show you a different song. Let me get into the dirt with you. Let me get into the challenge, into the struggle with you, because that's where love really happens. Not over here. We're like, you good? You good? I'm good. We're good. Let's move on. Jesus gets into the depths of that. And so for those of us who are walking with people who are struggling with mental health, we need to get into the depths. To love them well, we get into the deepest parts with them. And one of the ways we do that is kind of simple, but it takes some attention. It's just to pay attention. We listen to what we watch, and we listen and see what's going on in the person's life. For example, we want to look for things like a list of things. Like we want to look for the times when they're in social withdrawal, pulling away from relationships, when they're having difficulty functioning at school or work, and having problems with memory and thinking. If you start to see those things, there's changes in their sleeping, eating, and hygiene habits. They're drinking more and they're abusing drugs, and that's a new thing. Extreme mood changes. And then, of course, thoughts of suicide. When we see those things happen, we pay attention and see those things happen. Something is going on. And so if we see that, the one thing we can't do is this. You good? How are y'all good over there? That's a moment where we need to step in and we need to ask some different questions. That's a moment where we need to step in and ask them, hey, how are things really? In my house, we say, how are things in your head? Scale of 1 to 10. And then if we don't think that she's telling the truth or that we're telling the truth to each other, we'll go, okay, last 2%. Pure honesty. How are things in your head? Scale of 1 to 10. We get in deep because that's where love really happens. And so there's going to be some things that come from that. If we don't go, you good, and stay over here, if we get involved in that, there are going to be some things that happen. We're going to have to change some priorities. There are going to be some places our kids and our spouse cannot go because it's triggering to them. For us to love them well is to know that. Sometimes that place for some people is church. It's important for us to know that. It's important for us to respect that. There are some conversations that people in our lives will not be able to have. To love them well, to not go you good, to get in the depths of it with them, to sing a new song, is to know we can't have that conversation. We got to go around it. We got to go differently. It's to watch the people in our lives, whether they're our teenagers or whether someone else in our life, if they change their fashion habits, they start wearing long sleeves and long pants in times like now when it's super hot, that's something we should ask about. Self-harm is one of the common ways that people deal with anxiety and depression, and it can be a precursor for suicide. Most self-harm takes place on the arms or the inner parts of the torso or the stomach. And it's just a way of dealing with big emotions. 17% of all people will harm themselves at some point in their life, and most of them do it for the first time before they're 13 years old. We pay attention. We don't go, nice fashion choice. We go, what's going on? That's different. And when they start telling us how they feel, we have to respond in a different way. And there are some things we can say in response, and these are just a few things that we would say in response. Like, I'm sorry you're feeling this way. Can you share a bit more? Tell me more. Tell me more is the best thing you can say to someone struggling with what they're feeling. It sounds like you're in tremendous pain and you can't see a way out. That's an incredible way to respond. Another way to say it is, maybe you're wondering how life got this complicated and difficult. Just empathy. Right now, you're just not sure of the answers to the problems that you're facing. And you must really, really be hurting to consider ending your life. What you're basically saying is not, you good? What you're saying is, I see that this is difficult. And I love you too much to just let you go through the difficulty. So let's talk about it. Let me hear the song you're singing, the desolation song, the bog song you're singing. Let me hear that. And this takes courage and commitment, but I have to tell you, one of the most loving things we can do for each other is to listen closely to each other's song. It's one of the most loving things we can do. Now, here's what I know. For those of us who have someone like that in our life, we're like, okay, fine. If I don't, hey, you good? If I get into it with that person, they're going to tell me something, and I'm not going to know what to do with it. What if I say, instead of you good, what if instead I get into the midst of it and they tell me something and I'm like, I've got to do something and I have no idea what to do? Number one, there are resources here at Parkview. Call us. If it seems like it's desperate enough, call 911. But ultimately, what they need is not for you to answer every question, because you won't. Let that pressure go. You're not going to be able to solve that problem, answer every single question they have. Instead, what they need for you to do is sing your song. They don't need you to fix it. They need you to know that they need to know that you're there. But they also need to know that there's a new song, that there's something different, that life doesn't have to look this way. And there's a good reason for that. In the story Jesus tells of Jesus washing the feet, Peter, he gets to Peter and Peter goes, Are you gonna wash my feet? Are you really gonna wash my feet? And that can go two different ways. The one way is to say, this is beneath you, Jesus. The other way to go is to say, no one's ever done this for me before. And for a lot of our family, friends who are dealing with mental health, there is a loneliness that is on them. Because they've been told in one way or another, they have to deal with this all on their own. You just need to pray harder, smile more. When you exercise, have you ever tried yoga? My cousin's brother's sister did a juice cleanse and it totally fixed their depression. They've heard that over and over and over again, and they feel like the problem is theirs. And so they're used to doing this on their own. And so when we show up, they're like, are you really going to get in this with me? Are you really going to do this? Are you, as a person of faith, because I kind of feel like God has abandoned me, are you really, as a person who follows Jesus, going to get in the midst of this and not just go, I'll pray for you? There's nothing wrong with praying for people. But I think sometimes God's answer to our prayers when we're praying for people with mental health is, hey, yeah, you've got an hour and they love tacos. You be the answer. They really want to know, are you going to be in this with me? My dear friend said this. She said, it can be easy to hide. At my lowest, I was sleeping for 16 hours a day and working for 8. My coworkers didn't know because I was able to hide it. And she said, check on your people. I have a few key friends and mentors in my life who have freedom to speak into my life and ask me hard questions about my mental health. I have literally had a friend dig so deep she wanted to make sure I wasn't dealing with suicidal ideation or that I needed to get another layer of professional help. It may have been an unexpected conversation for me at the time, but on the other side, I was so thankful someone cared enough about me to ask those types of questions. Those questions are so important. Checking on your people is so important. Getting away from this and getting into this is so important, because research tells us when it comes to suicide, the one thing that can be a predictor of preventing suicide is this feelings of being connected. Strong connections to individuals, family, community, and social institutions is one of the things that keeps people from following through on a suicide attempt. Check on your people. Are you really going to do this? Yes, I'm not going to stand over here. I'm going to get into it with you. You don't have to do this by yourself. You don't have to do this by yourself. Check on your people. Pay attention and listen. And Jesus did that. Jesus taught this. Jesus gave this example because he knew he was leaving. We hear this in John 13:1. It says that Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. And then he says, and since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I've given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Why did he do this? Because he knew he was leaving. I am going to leave this world, and there are still going to be people who need to know that someone is going to get into the mess with them. Somebody is going to show up. Somebody is going to sing a new song. The world needs to know that, and now they will know it through you. Those of us who love Jesus, who follow Jesus, who have people in our life with mental health challenges, Jesus is saying, I have left you to sing a new song for them. Don't stay over here. Step into the midst of it. Step into the midst of it with them. Because there's something else going on in them, and this is my friend one last time. She said, even though I struggle with mental illness, I still find deep joy in following Christ. That's an encouragement to those of you who are struggling with your mental health. Your mental health does not have to separate you from God. He is always with me, never leaving me, a constant companion. When I don't have words, he sees my tears. He delights in me equally on my good days and not so good days. I don't have to pretend or put a mask on to sit in his presence. And honestly, knowing that makes me fall even more in love with him. If you have people in your life who are struggling, don't stay over here. Pray for them, absolutely. But as you're praying, move toward them. Step into the mess with them. Sing a new song for them so they know that their song in their head is not the only one that's out there. In the late part, the last day of 2021, December 30th, as people were making plans for a new year, a series of wildfires ripped through the Marshall Road area of Boulder, Colorado, burning up scrub grass, trees, everything in its path. Thousands of people were displaced from their homes. Thankfully, only 2 people died, but I get to say that because I don't know those people. Any loss of life is challenging. My friends Mindy and Jeff lived in the path of the Marshall Road fire. And so when it got bad enough, they were evacuated from their homes and they left and went to stay with friends. And then when everything was clear and they were given the all clear, they came back to their neighborhood, which was right in the path of the fire. And of course, they came back to their neighborhood to see, they didn't know, is their house still standing? Is everything still there? And so they came back and they stepped down their street and they stood in front of their house and it was all intact. So Mindy stood and looked at her house and then she pivoted to the left and she looked at the house next door and this is what she found. Now, this is a tragic picture, as you can see. There once was a house there and a family there, and all that's left now are some pillars and a basketball goal. But here's the interesting thing about this story. My friend Mindy didn't know that picture was being taken. There was a reporter from the local newspaper who was in the area surveying the damage, and he saw her looking at the house, and he took that picture from behind. Later he said, "Can I put this in the paper?" And she said, "Yeah, just don't use my name." What you need to know is if you're wrestling with mental health today, sometimes you wake up and wonder, will everything burn down today? Will the plans I have for today, will the things I want to do, will it happen, or will I just be standing in front of a skeleton of the day I wanted, the skeleton of the life I wanted, and everything is burnt down? But here's what we who walk with you get to do. We get to be the ones who are there to take the picture. We're the ones who are there that you don't know are there, that are going to support you and help you rebuild. We are the ones who are going to love you enough to not just stand back and go, "Hey, you going to be okay? You got a place to stay? Have a good day." But instead, we get to get into the midst of it with you because Jesus gave us the example of how to love those who are wrestling with their mental health and to do it well. Let's pray together. God, we're grateful that you have done this and given us this picture through Jesus of what it looks like to truly love one another. We're grateful for the fact that you don't leave us in the midst of our mental health, but you are with us. And so for my friends in this room who are walking with someone who is having a difficult time right now, I pray that you help them not to stand back and stand away, but to step in and get into the depths of it with them. I pray you give them the courage and the grace and the energy to do what they need to do. And for my friends who are dealing with anxiety and depression and PTSD and trauma and obsessive compulsive and grief and all the things that wound us mentally and emotionally, I pray that you help them to hear a new song today. Whether that's through somebody else or whether it's something you just give them as a result of their openness to you. May you teach them a brand new song. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.